Okay, everyone seems even more on time. So I'm very happy to welcome you here. My name is Hanna Oliinyk. I work for Ukrainian Institute, and Ukrainian Institute is a public institution affiliated to Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We present Ukraine internationally and work with cultural diplomacy. I'm head of visual arts there. And it's my pleasure, the pleasure of the whole Ukrainian Institute, to be cooperating with the Open Eye Gallery and Max and Vika for many years in a row. We have the honor and pleasure to support this symposium, and we jointly partnered in organizing the big project called Home Perspectives in Liverpool 2 years ago during the Eurovision Festival, and last year we also supported the symposium curated by Katerina Feduk, another researcher and curator on photography from Ukraine, dedicated to researching and curating Ukrainian photography. It's also nice to have these long-term effects from us, and we will be ready to present a publication of essays on the basis of last year's symposium pretty soon, so stay tuned and follow the channels of Open Eye Gallery, because that's where you will be able to receive this information. And all of this was also possible because of the support of the British Council, so we are also grateful for this long-term partnership to our partners. And I will be moderating this discussion, and I'm now happy to present the two speakers that we have online. Here we have Max Houghton. Max is a course leader for MA Photojournalism and Documentary Photography at London College of Communication, the University of Arts, London. Max, hello. Good to hear you. Good to have you here with us online.
Thank you so much.
And also here with me is Hanna Oliinyk. Hanna is a researcher at the Center for Socio-Legal Studies of Oxford University. And we will talk about photography as evidence and use of photography in Holocaust trials. That's the specialty of Max's research. And also in nowadays practice, how Ukrainians are using photography as evidence from this practical perspective, which Hanna will share. I think I will not take the more time and floor from the speakers, because I think that is also a very important aspect on how we talk about war photography. And Max, I will pass the floor to you to present your research to us.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. And yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks to everyone at Open Eye for permitting me to be here from afar on the building site that is these days Elephant and Castle. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
that's good. Great. I'll just go straight in if that's okay. This is the title of my very recently submitted PhD, Prosecutorial Aesthetics, Law, Image, Imagination at Nuremberg, 1945 to 1946. And hopefully what I will talk about now is a useful precursor to why we need to think about these things today. So the foundational moment of international criminal law in 1945 is rich with the images created by and for the International Military Tribunal, which I might refer to as the IMT. It was for the senior Nazi leadership at Nuremberg. Hitler and Goebbels were already dead to suicide, and the most senior Nazi president was Göring, accompanied on the benches by Hess. Feigning amnesia, Hans Frank, Butcher of Poland, propagandist Julius Streicher, et al. It was the Allied powers, the UK, the USA, France, and the Soviets that had decided that it would be law. It would be the discipline of law that would restore balance to a ravaged Europe. Next slide, please. So this is drawn from my thesis, which looks back at the trial 8 decades on to propose thinking with images to re-engage with its abundant legal and cultural histories, because obviously there's a very pressing need to understand international criminal law and its limits. The IMT inaugurated significant new regimes of seeing, which were allied to and yet complicated notions of juridical truth in ways which would prevail for decades. At the trial, both still and moving images became admissible as evidence in new and radical ways. This image here is actually the press pass that admitted people to trial, which is an interesting kind of iconology all of its own that I won't go into here. But it was created by the presentation branch of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the American intelligence agency, which was the precursor to the CIA, who made many of the images that I'll be showing you today. At the trial, both still and moving images became admissible as evidence. I already said that, but they made visible the worst atrocities committed by Nazis against the human person, and the laws and policies that enabled the as yet unnamed, it wasn't named as the Holocaust or as genocide at Nuremberg. The power of the visual was employed to other ends too, to cement this new discourse of international criminal law as a global arbiter of truth. And because the trial was a largely American operation, it situated the United States specifically as the purveyor of that truth. And this constellation of images is what I call prosecutorial aesthetics. I define it as a system of knowledge that's evidence of the much discussed visual term in law. Its prosecutorial aesthetics owed much to the photojournalistic magazine culture that dominated America's liberal democratic culture at the time, which was the empire of publishing magnate Henry Luce, who owned Lifetime and Fortune. Luce's empire was founded on a shared dream of civic life that was understood and reaffirmed by the photographic image. It was also founded on his fervent belief that American internationalism was the answer to world ills, and his writing in a kind of manifesto called American Century showed that American values, he believed, must be applied globally. It was the beginning of the US as world policeman. The image of the IMT would be created by colleagues and associates of Henry Luce, and these were the same men, and they were mostly men, who worked for the Office of Strategic Services. There was a lot of traffic. It wasn't exactly the same people, but there was a lot of traffic between Luce's empire and the OSS, and they shared a vision of democracy. Nuremberg did succeed in its primary aim to prosecute the Nazi war criminals and the crimes that, in Hannah Arendt's memorable phrase, exploded the limits of the law. And while the trial played a foundational role in re-establishing the rule of law after World War II, it had two other very important legacies, which, number one, to establish that leaders must incur individual personal responsibility, and secondly, equally second, to embed aggressive war then as the supreme international crime. The Nuremberg Principles, as I'm sure many of you know, but they influenced the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the Genocide Convention of the same year, and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 1988. It left many legacies in its wake. So I created an archive or counter-archive because these images, they continue to define ways of seeing victims and perpetrators, and they continue to resonate in terms of ideas of ethics and spectatorship, I think. So I'm not ready to go through the images yet, if that's okay. Yeah, I'll just say next slide, please, because otherwise it really won't make any sense. Sorry, hope that's okay. So today, this conference is all about the concept of iconic images, and one of the images that is iconic and that has gone into collective memory, which is one of the things my thesis discusses, is a famous image from the Stroop report, which was shown in evidence at Nuremberg, called The Child at Gunpoint. The Child at Gunpoint. I'm not showing it today. It is an iconic image. It shows a small boy, many of you will know it, with his hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender as he's driven from the Warsaw Ghetto. And so that is an image from Nuremberg that did become iconic. Many of the images that I have assembled for this counter-archive are for the most part not iconic, not even known or published, but when considered together and also in context. And what I mean by that is how they were shown in court, what the prosecutor said as they were shown, what else was shown on the same day. Films, film clips, material evidence, witness testimony. Nuremberg was largely a trial by document, but these images reveal much about how specific crimes were prosecuted and crimes that were evident that were not prosecuted at Nuremberg. Also about how the relationship between the individual and the collective is navigated in different registers. And finally, perhaps what a totalitarian regime is it designed to do to the human body. So if we can just stay on this image for a moment. So I've been talking about the very American nature of the trial, this intense visuality, but it had a surprising precursor. And this image here is evidence of that. The lineage of certain key inclusions and decisions for Nuremberg emanates clearly, though largely unacknowledged, from Soviet aesthetics. This fascinating discovery is not my personal original contribution to scholarship. It's been drawn from writings by Francine Hirsch, Jeremy Hicks, Victor Barbat. But because of who we are gathered today, I thought that we decided it would be pertinent to include this. At Nuremberg, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were already starting to simmer. It's widely documented that the Americans, and perhaps a majority in the courtroom, didn't trust the Soviets, whether that was because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, their known guilt for the Katyn massacre, for which they indicted the Nazis all the same, or because of Stalin's legal processes. The infamous Soviet show trials had made a mockery out of justice, frequently built on false confessions and a predetermination of guilt. Yet, the reach and influence upon Nuremberg of two such Soviet trials, which took place during the war, is important. The US prosecutorial aesthetics borrowed from Soviet aesthetics and jurisprudence by replicating their judicial use of film for two trials in Krasnodar, which is this one, and in Kharkov in July and December 1943, which actually bookended the Moscow Declaration in October that led to Nuremberg, basically. So the Krasnodar trial was defined, like Nuremberg, as a military tribunal. 11 Soviet citizens accused of collaborating with Germany were found guilty, 8 were sentenced to death. A film was made of the trial and its subsequent public hangings, which was widely shown across the vast territories of the Soviet Union, intended as a deterrent. The filming of Krasnodar was essential to its operation and its pedagogic function to show the necropolitical power of an authoritarian government. This image that you see here shows where it took place, which is in the Velikan, which was the town's cinema. Everyone was, as expected, found guilty, and 8 were sentenced to death by hanging. A film directed by Mark Troyanovsky was made of the trial and the hangings, which was widely shown. The speech for the prosecution at Krasnodar was delivered by the state prosecutor, Yechenin, after the formal investigation. It made the Soviet chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Roman Rudenko's opening pale in comparison. Yechenin said, "For 6 months, these swarms of brown locusts devoured and devastated the bounteous Krasnodar territory. Reeling back under the blows of our Red Army, they left a trail of blood and tears, heaps of corpses, fire, and an abyss of hopeless misery." So what they did in the film, they kind of made much witness testimony, which didn't happen as much at Nuremberg, but they kind of moved the footage in and out of the courtroom to images of decaying corpses. We can show the next slide, please. And this tying together of atrocity and testimony on film was an aesthetic strategy that didn't quite follow through to Nuremberg, though the filming of the trial did. But Victor Barbat attributes the inclusion of documentary footage like this as a justification, a kind of pre-justification for the hangings that would take place, that were a foregone conclusion. And this cinematic style of extreme full frontal close-ups of the dead would prefigure the gruesome images that the Soviet evidentiary film screened at Nuremberg that they would later contain. Next slide, please. In another foreshadowing of Nuremberg, 8 are sentenced to death by hanging. The film didn't shy away, the film of Krasnodar, from showing law's ultimate authority, as you can see here. And though the precise moment of death is elided, a frame shows the nooses being adjusted into place on the necks of the guilty men and the stools being kicked away, redistributing the dust beneath their feet. The next slide, please. The camera switches between the deathly spectacle and the faces of the crowd, a 30,000 strong crowd, and its rapturous reception of the spectacle. The final frames show the suspended, slumped bodies, next slide please, as the final evidence of the consequences of their transgression. Each of the dead wears a sign around his neck saying executed for treason. In Kharkov, the trial indicted 3 Nazi defendants and 1 Russian collaborator. Again, it took place in a similar venue, not the cinema this time, but the theatre, and these ideas of performativity are continued in Nuremberg. The judges were seated high on the stage in front of heavy theatre drapes. There was inevitable public hanging filmed for this too, and again, it was very well attended. There was a report in the British publication The Spectator, which said that there were 6,000 people in attendance at the hangings, and indeed at the trial. Sorry, 6,000 at the trial, and then an even larger crowd for the hangings. This trial was filmed too by Coppola, who was a Stalin laureate, and another film was made. So what is particularly interesting, next slide please, is that Life magazine in 1944 showed not the trial, but the still images from the trial. So even though the Americans at this stage were kind of somewhat dubious of Soviet justice, even though they would never show public hangings in America, and know the public hangings, sorry, not the public, but the hangings of the Nazi war criminals that happened eventually were very much not public and were very much not pictured. But fascinatingly, Life magazine produced this report. So in a way, this was a moment when the USA kind of sanctioned Soviet justice, at least sometimes. At this point in history, Soviet justice was very much yoked to visual media in a way that American justice hadn't been. And it was the Soviets' established relationship between film and justice that the US wanted to copy, basically. The other foreshadowing of the prosecutorial aesthetics is the gallows, and this was kind of a glimpse into the future of what would happen but wouldn't be seen. And out of interest, Justice Jackson, who presided over the trial entirely, the American judge, was not an advocate of the death penalty. And yet, just as almost a subtext to this, public hangings would take place in America in the forms of lynchings, which I call kind of pseudo-legal, because they were not stopped, the perpetrators were not prosecuted. So these spectacles did happen in America, but very much undercover and not something that America would want to picture or be pictured doing. Next slide, please. I just want to briefly show you what the courtroom looked like at Nuremberg. It's not the focus of of this presentation. It's certainly one of the focuses of my chapters. But as you can see from this image, I think that the courtroom was very much designed to be seen. You can see the huge lights above the courtroom, and you can see kind of the visibility. Next slide, please. And you can see here there's a huge screen. It's got a chart, which is an example of infographics that I'm going to talk about a little bit in this presentation today. But this was the focus of the courtroom. So when it wasn't an infographic on there, a film might be shown there. The American relationship to the evidentiary power of the documentary film was ascendant. Newsreel footage was shown in cinemas throughout the land before the main Hollywood offering. Obviously, Hollywood was, the dominant kind of cultural form in America in the 30s and leading up to the war. What happened in American documentary photography that was pictured in Luce's Time, Life and Fortune magazines was being replicated in documentary film. There were series like March of Time and Why We Fight, and they relied heavily on documentary footage of war for this very specific brand of nationalism. America needed to show it was great. It was its own form of propaganda. It's not normally called that in relation to America, but of course it was. The films were in effect compilations, these newsreels that I'm talking about. Bazin, the film theorist, said that they was very critical of them, basically. He said it was a new originality, and none of the films of which they are composed were photographed for these films. And this gave, for him, a deception. This created a deception within the documentary genre. He said it was a grave confusion of values on the manipulation of psychology, credulity, and perception. He called it edited, ideological documentary. So I want to talk a bit now about how these films and this kind of evidence, this visual evidence, was permitted even in court. So one of the members of the OSS who joined Field Photographic, that was one of its branches, like the presentation branch and like research and analysis, they all worked together. This whole trial was a convergence of all these creative disciplines coming together. There was a director called Marion C. Cooper that joined at the behest of his great friend John Ford. And although he was perhaps most renowned for directing King Kong, he had realist credentials. And they stretch back to a documentary motion picture he made in 1925 called Grass, the Epic of a Lost Tribe. A bit like Flaherty's Nanook of the North. And the fascinating thing about this, and I only found this out by kind of Googling his name to find out who Marion C. Cooper was, but it contains in 1925 the first known use of an affidavit within the film. So it has a certificate of authenticity in this film, conferring truth within this very early example of a silent documentary. And that's the kind of the principle that Nuremberg picked up upon. All of the documentary films curated for Nuremberg were sealed with affidavits. They were both spoken in the courtroom and also created as a frame to be screened within the film itself. So this multiple acts of witnessing bestow an authenticity upon the film, perhaps avoiding what Bazin was getting at, and they were propelled into the category of evidence. Next slide, please. So this, is that what we produced okay for you? It doesn't really matter. It's just to show you that it's a memorandum. Looks a little blurred on my screen here, but anyway, it's a memorandum from James Donovan. In the presentation, he had an extraordinary title. He was head of visual evidence. That's not a usual job at a trial. There was one at this trial, it was him. And this is a memo from him to detail the approach to verification for the War Crimes Office. And he was delineating what was required, so what people needed to go out and get as evidence, so images of atrocities, including killing, torture, rape, repressive measures, violations of the Geneva Convention, persecution, etc. The final paragraph states, all cases should be examined for evidence of a general policy or of systematic terror. The priority of this memorandum is acquiring documents, original or certified, together with a full account of their acquisition, location, custody, and reproduction. So this is the principle that was operative in kind of all of the evidence at Nuremberg. Okay, for the final part of the presentation, I'm going to move on to specific crimes. So next slide, please. All 12 of the defendants who were all of 12 of the defendants who were sentenced to hang at Nuremberg were found guilty of crimes against humanity. So crimes against humanity was the new crime that was created by Herschel-Pact for Nuremberg. It was a brand new crime. The other crimes were not new crimes. War crimes, aggressive war crimes against peace. They were not new crimes. Crimes against humanity was. So Nuremberg had a really big job to do. Sorry, next slide, please. That's just a book that was made of those trials. And this is the article that allowed in all kinds of evidence. But crimes against humanity was really important. Because it gave a name to something new. Of course, crimes against humanity had happened before. Genocides had happened in Europe, in Namibia, by the Germans, in fact, and by the Turks against the Armenians. But in a court of law, this was new. And I just want to show, it must be next slide, please. Thank you. Aggressive action. So this shows I said I'd mentioned infographics. This is an example of how the presentation branch of the OSS used infographics to convey a great deal of information and to commit it to memory. I mean, images like this have very interesting relationships to how information is remembered, and they're kind of mnemonic. So if you think of what did Germany kind of look like as it was marauding its way through Europe. So that's an image of the country. But when the prosecutor spoke about it in the courtroom, he talked about it as the incipient mouth of a wolf, which is, pretty fascinating to kind of be able to visualize what aggressive war looks like. And as I think I already said, but aggressive war was understood then to be the kind of the world's most important crime, and that's obviously changed now. Genocide has this kind of categorization, even though it's so incredibly hard to prove. Next slide, please. That's just it in the courtroom, a different version of it. And next slide, please. This another amazing infographic titled "Totalitarian Control of Propaganda, Culture, and Education." That I just find I analyze this image in quite a lot of detail that I won't do here, but just to say it shows how totalitarian control, for me, it shows how it weighs down on the individual, kind of pushed ever sort of smaller and harder by these arrows. And to take away, to make anonymous, to make lonely, to take away all individuality. And if a system can do this, to take away a person's name, to make them disposable, then anything can happen. They can do whatever they want with that. So final few slides, please. So next slide, please. Just to come back to this idea of how crimes against humanity was made manifest in the courtroom. There was this extraordinary moment on the 13th of December 1945 when a very short film, if it can even be called that, was brought into proceedings by Major William Walsh, who was Assistant Trial Counsel for the US. And the heading of his prosecution was Persecution of the Jews. And he kind of questioned what persecution meant. He said it wasn't enough to say what had happened. The film is just 90 seconds long, and it offered shakily shot imagery by an amateur filmmaker believed to be a member of the SS. The sworn affidavit revealed the filmmaker had been captured and was in barracks near Augsburg. It hovered at the very limits of evidence. We'll see a couple of images in a second, but I want to point out what James Donovan did with this film. So when he brought it into evidence, he requested to show it twice because it had been burnt, and the film had been burnt, and he understood that it wouldn't be easy to assimilate, but there's lots of reasons why what's in the film is difficult to assimilate. So I suggest that this 90-second film showed images that would be part of the proof for rape as a war crime, which is part of crimes against humanity. Rape wasn't a specific element that was prosecuted at Nuremberg, not until the Rome Statute. Sexual violence was discussed, but there were limits to it. So for me, it's fascinating that Donovan decided to make this ekphrasis. He decided to delineate it scene by scene. And if you read, the descriptions, it shows this extraordinary brutality. To have the ekphrasis in that way. The transcript doesn't dwell on the idea that the film was burned, but the assertion that I've read elsewhere that it was burned because it was held for too long to a projection lamp. The idea that it was the act of looking that caused disturbance to vision. But also it brings to mind these ideas of a seal being broken by burning of an elemental force. So damaged was the film, it couldn't be reproduced as a motion picture. The moving images had to be stilled. They were transferred to 35mm negative film strips and positive proof sheets. And so it couldn't be kept intact, much like the people in the film to whom these atrocious events happened. They happened in Lviv. And I'll just show you a couple of the stills from it in the next two slides, please, and just end on the idea that this invisible element of crimes against humanity, against the human spirit, against the human status, are made manifest within this burnt film. The 8mm film did tell of individual women's experience of rape in wartime, and even though it was shown at the trial, the prosecution couldn't see it contemporaneously. And Primo Levi, in writing of his experience of Auschwitz, writes of visual and acoustic memories he can't explain, languages he doesn't know, speculating that they may almost be an unconscious preparation for bearing witness. And the need to bear witness, to apprehend the suffering of another, has an ethical impetus pointing towards justice. I've got another paragraph. Should I end it there in interest of time?
I think we should end because we need to give additional time for Hanna to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. Thank you very much for this retrospective information. I think it's important for us to understand these lessons from the history and the past if we are talking now about current conflicts. As the previous discussion with Hanna Oliinyk, you also mentioned that Ukrainian war is the most documented war, and now we have to deal with a lot of more documented information and photographs and pictures than it was in Second World War. But there are a lot of similarities in that as well. Max, please stay with us for question and answer part, and I pass the mic to Hanna.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I also have a few slides to show. Is it on this? Okay. I should make a short disclaimer first. Unlike everyone else, I guess, in this audience, I do not come from the perspective of visual arts, and I do not deal directly with photography. I'm as a researcher, I'm residing in a field of sociology of human rights. So about last 3 years, I spent researching how Ukrainian legal professionals working. And initially, this project was not designed to focus on war crimes. However, if you talk to Ukrainian legal professionals over the last 3 years, of course, war crimes are going to be there because it is, of course, part of the as much as everyday reality, as much as professional reality as well. And we've been thinking with my colleague and supervisor how to give proper spotlight for the war crimes in this project. So we came up with additional idea and thinking also about the scope of evidences that Ukrainian legal professionals should deal at the moment. Speaking about, we can move to the next slide. So basically, a photo made by Hanna Oliinyk from this first weeks of siege of Mariupol made us really think how photos like this, we already had a chance to see it during his talk. Photos like this are such an evident proof of war crimes happening. So how can evidences collected not by legal professionals or like law enforcement agencies, but by media, journalists, videographers, how they can contribute to the legal discourse, how they can shape international human rights law. And that's how 1 month ago we actually started to work on this another project, trying to include not only legal professionals into this legal justice narrative, but also expand it towards media professionals and towards ordinary citizens, and explore particularly how evidences, testimonies, documents that they are collecting can contribute to the future justice tribunals. I want to set an agenda a bit. Next slide. Sorry. I want to set an agenda a bit with reference to the classic, to the quotation from classic work of Susan Sontag, when basically she said that the very notion of atrocities, of war crime, is associated with the expectation of photographic evidence. Because photographs of atrocity illustrate as well as corroborate, and with passing disputes about exactly how many were killed, numbers often inflated at first, the photograph gives the indelible sample. And historically, as Sontag points out, next slide, we used to deal with some sort of condensed aftermath because people didn't have this instant access to technologies and opportunity to exchange these evidences as instantly as they can do it now. However, as it has already been mentioned, when it comes to Ukraine, we are dealing with the most documented war, and we are dealing with a situation when war crimes evidences, particularly in format of photo or video, can be documented almost in real time. And we can see in real time how Russians are attacking maternity hospitals or children's hospitals, and how they're doing whatever is classified according to the international humanitarian law as war crimes. And before I speak about some particular examples from Ukrainian practice, I want to focus a bit on technicalities. Next slide. Because when it comes this is the thing that I just mentioned, that basically today we are coming to the process when collecting evidences for war crimes. This process is becoming more horizontal and more democratic, because not only like documental photographer or law enforcement agencies involved into doing that, but also ordinary citizens who became witnesses of atrocities can contribute to these ongoing justice processes. Next slide. If we come from very technical perspective, from methodological perspective, how photos can serve as evidences in criminal files, there are like very clear requirements, and for each specific country, it could be like a bit different, but overall, we can rely on the guidelines specified by the International Criminal Court. So it's all very intuitive. You should have very clear metadata and attribution. So when you want to make a photo, you want to submit like an evidence, you should make sure that you have your GPS on, you record date, time, location. You also should be super careful. You also should document your ID. You should preserve all technical metadata. Should try and aim to make and submit this photo in high resolution, minimal compression. Ensure that you do not edit it, you do not do some color editing and stuff. There is specific photographic methodology that is recommended to apply, like you should include, for example, scale references, so investigators could see how big or small objects are. You should document the scene of crime from different angles. You should start from wide shots to close-up shots. And avoid any manipulations and post-processing later. Maintain and record chain of custody and document all transfers that are being done with this particular photography. And it is reflected also in admissibility criteria, which is the next slide. So basically, photos that you submit as an evidence should fit these four criteria: authenticity, relevance, probative value, and procedural compliance. I will not stop for long here, but basically this is again about non-alteration photo. It's about showing direct connection to the investigated crime, to demonstrating elements of crimes, and being sure that this photo was done, transferred, and corroborated with all appropriate procedures. There is also a Berkeley protocol, which was published in 2022. Next slide. Which is basically a methodology for collecting digital sources from open sources, which also can serve as an evidence in investigation processes. This methodology pretty much similar to what already has been said. If you like collect a photo, for example, from social media, you should also aim you should also like have very specific methodology how you should verify it, how you should cross-check it, and especially when it comes to social media, metadata can be stripped when you download a photo from social media. So Berkeley protocol particularly gives you some tools and methodologies how to cross-check this particular photo, for example, a video, for it to be later used in the investigation process. And people who are working with collecting evidences from open sources, they are heavily relying on procedures defined there. Of course, there are also ethical requirements, which says that you should try to obtain informed consent when it's possible, to assess potential harm from using and publishing these images, and respect victims' privacy and dignity. I was trying to keep this technical things short because I want to talk a bit more about some particular cases and how it is done in real life, and particularly reflect a bit more how we can consider work of documental photographer, of media journalists. Can we actually see a potential there for these images being later used in criminal investigations? Next slide. So this is a quote from interview with young Ukrainian documental photographer, Fedor Petrov, who currently works for German newspaper Der Spiegel. He started his documental career pretty recently, basically since the start of the full-scale invasion. And then what he is saying is that even if photo technically meets all the requirements and contains all the metadata, this doesn't automatically make it suitable for use in the court. For example, when it comes to the work of documentary photographers who doing it professionally and this is their bread and butter, it's actually not always an easy road. Of course, these photographers speaking louder than whatever is done in investigation because that process is usually slower, etc. But there are some obstacles from using these particular photographs in criminal proceedings. For example, further referencing lawyer Wayne Jordash, who handles cases for international tribunals and have been involved in the context of the war in Ukraine since 2015, said that in international tribunals, lawyers are very hesitant to use photographs that has been done by professional photographers because they're expecting that defense can undermine credibility of this photo by saying, with this evidence by saying that this is just an artistic vision, so like this is profession of the photographer to communicate some sort of message. So technically speaking, from the point of view, coming back to the point that now we are observing that process of evidence gathering becomes more horizontal and democratic. Sometimes low quality photo made on regular smartphone can have bigger weight in this investigation process than photos made by professional journalists, for example. But it certainly does not diminish work that journalists are doing in Ukraine, if we're talking about Ukrainian case. And of course, their images influence greatly global discourse, and of course, it is influencing what's happening in terms of global politics. It influences, for example, prospects of creating justice tribunals. And sorry, I put this slide a bit earlier, but basically, if you remember this event, can we come back to the previous slide? Yeah, basically, it's only, I just now came to the story. End of February, this disastrous meeting in White House, Zelensky and Donald Trump. What people could forget by the end of this meeting that it started actually with Zelensky showing a set of photographs to Trump. Basically, it was photographs of Ukrainian prisoners of war coming back from captivity. And as Feder said, that it's a big dream of all photographers that a photo could change something. Most likely it won't happen, but in my case, something like that did happen. Zelensky, during a meeting at the White House, showed Trump a portrait that I had taken. This is, in a sense, that photographer's dream that your photo will change something. Among these photos that Zelensky was showing to Trump, were photos that Feder made. It was a photo of Alexei Anuля, a kickboxer champion from Chernihiv, who came back from Russian captivity, and he changed beyond recognition because of tortures and poor treatment, which had been done to Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian captivity. And this is basically was the way to communicate this message and illustrate these war crimes that Russians are doing to Ukrainians. And of course, according to Feder, it was the closest that he has come so far through his photos to bring in the perpetrators to justice. But of course, 10 minutes later, this discussion ended up in discussing who has cards and who were sued. So it didn't end up well back on that day. But we can move to next slide. Sometimes in international courts proceedings, we can observe actually situation from another side. So basically, we are trying to understand how particular photographs which are depicting scenes of crimes can serve as an evidence, but sometimes photograph can serve as a document itself. So I had an interview with one Ukrainian human rights lawyer who was leading the case of Ukrainian citizen who is trapped in Donetsk prison. He's not a political prisoner, so he has some sort of access to, he used to have, not anymore, to like mobile phones and he could reach out via internet to Ukrainian human rights lawyers. And this particular story about this guy, that he spent, by the time we were conducting this interview, almost 9 years in pre-trial detention. So he was trapped in this sort of legal limbo when he was arrested by Ukrainian authorities. Then the war has started. Not all prisoners, like most of the prisoners, haven't been evacuated. And he sort of was stuck in that pre-trial detention for years because so-called DNR authorities also didn't particularly know what to do with him. And he decided that he will find a way to apply to at least some sort of authorities, and he reached out to lawyers from one of the Ukrainian NGOs, and they started to prepare his case, and they actually submitted it to the European Court of the Human Rights. And of course, I was very curious how this communication was going on, because Guy was literally sitting in the prison in Donetsk with very limited opportunities to communicate with outside world. And one of the options was communicating via messengers and also sending some documents. He did prepare these documents by himself. Then he was making photos on his smartphone and was sending it to his lawyer via messenger. So it was basically a photo of the document, and it wasn't the best quality. And of course, it was visible that it was a photo. Lawyer would print it out and attach it to this case to the CTHR, explaining why this is just printed photo. And this is a quote when she's explaining how they were exchanging this information. So we maintained contact by phone through messengers, not constantly. That is when there is such an opportunity, maybe once a month, we can get in touch with each other, exchange information. He can take some photograph of a document or write an explanation. He also made statements for me from his cellmates, for example, witnesses. He sends these photographs. We send these photographs with live signatures to the ECTHR as evidences. So it made me also think that sometimes there is a very blurry line between a photo and a document, and it can work vice versa. But also, we should be honest that ECTHR probably a very loyal institution in terms of these requirements, like what particularly should be recognized as evidence, what particularly should have this judicial power or not. Now I want to move to give very broad grasp to different documental initiatives happening on the ground. Next slide, please. Of course, there are not a huge number, but definitely a few dozens of different official and non-official Ukrainian initiatives working with with collecting and documenting different sort of evidences, particularly photographic evidences. One of the main that should be mentioned is Ukrainian documentation project run by Office of the Prosecution General, where we have over 150,000 documented war crimes by now. So basically, this is a form which is developed at the next slide, please. Developed by Ukrainian Prosecution General, where you can just fill out the form and submit according to this methodology, which pretty much resembles that technical requirements that I was mentioning before. You can submit, if you're ordinary citizen or journalist who has this information, you can submit your collected evidences for them to be later cross-checked and used in possible investigations. What is also worth saying that in the Office of the Prosecution General, since the start of the full-scale invasion, the War Department was created, and they are very much in charge of investigation and in charge of collecting these evidences, and they didn't come from nowhere. Of course, since 2014, some specialized units were existing in Ukrainian persecution, but since 2022, the scale of crimes became so vast that there was a need to open separate department, and now we also have war departments in prosecution offices in 10 Ukrainian regions. We can move to the next slide. But what Ukrainian law enforcement agencies also trying to say is that justice is a common effort, and it includes military, media, human rights organizations, and ordinary citizens. Because, for example, when it comes to deoccupied territories, who is the first to enter these settlements, it's usually Ukrainian military. And understanding this, there is also, for example, instruction which is prepared for Ukrainian army, how to document war crimes that they are going to witness when they first enter liberated town or village, etc. So this is also trying to include as much audience as possible to documenting processes. Also, there are a number of different instructions for journalists, how they should prepare photographs, videos, from which angles to record, how to record themselves, how to identify themselves, for it later to be used as an evidence. And next slide. And also we have huge number, not huge number, but also again probably a few dozens projects run by Ukrainian human rights organizations. Some of them were existing since 2014. Some of them started to work after 2022, and it's actually very welcomed from Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, because often there are cases when they're collaborating together, because again the scale of atrocities and need to collect testimonies from people who suffered from Russian war crimes is so huge that I will not read this quotation, but basically there is a prosecutor from the War Department is saying that this is an ideal scenario when human rights organizations are trying to cover some regions where they just simply didn't make it because they didn't have enough, prosecution didn't have enough people to send them there, and then if they can exchange this information and basically use it as verify and use it as an evidence in their cases. I will also name probably few key human rights organization projects, which is the next slide. Just to give an overview. So basically, Ukraine 5 AM Coalition. This is the biggest coalition of the Ukrainian human rights initiatives. It was organized by 34 human rights organizations in Ukraine, and part of them have already had extensive experience in documenting Russian war crimes since 2015. And basically what they decided to do after the full-scale invasion, they decided to synchronize their sources and do this war crimes documented processes all together. And there are different options how you can submit your evidences. Particularly one of the options, screenshot on your left, it's basically Google Forms that you can fill out. Another influential player on this field, next slide please. This is also some sort of technicalities, that there is a special system which human rights organizations use to enter this information about war crimes. This particular system is IDOC, which is used by Ukrainian Helsinki Union, which helps to systematize collected information, helps lawyers to find some patterns, so later it will be used for submissions to the International Criminal Court. Next slide. So another big player on this field is an organization called Truth Hounds. Basically, the initial idea behind this project was bridging this gap between journalists collecting testimonies and recording testimonies of war crimes with investigation. And basically they have, their team include both like media and lawyers who are analyzing, collecting testimonies, verifying evidences, and also prepare legal submissions to the different judicial institutions. And as of now, they prepared at least 9 submissions to the International Criminal Court. For collecting evidences, visual evidences, they particularly use app which is called, okay, I'm finishing, which is called Eyewitness. Can I go to the next slide? So Eyewitness to Atrocities, it's actually an international app developed by International Bar Association. And one project I want to mention before I run out of time completely, it's Ukrainian War Archive. It's also an initiative this organization works very closely with. Next slide, please. Because this War Archive actually works towards collecting visual evidences and towards bringing them into a huge archive. At the moment, they collected more than 20 million visual images. They cross-check it. They basically follow all these methodologies for them later to be used in criminal proceedings. Also archiving it so wider audience could have access to this as well, like researchers or people who, like journalists, etc. So this is one of the options how you can submit evidences if you have some evidences and not so sure where to send them. And let me jump straight into conclusions. Sorry for overrunning time. It's next slide. So, next slide. Another important project I didn't have time to stop. Okay, to conclude. What is important to remember when we are talking about collecting visual evidences? First, war crimes have no statute of limitations, and also a principle of universal jurisdiction applies, which means that perpetrators can be held accountable anywhere, and also there is no time frame until which you can bring them to justice. So these evidences that we are collecting now, despite the fact that it's like huge scope of them, they can be used later. Maybe our generation will not see these processes, but there is hope that it can happen. We are witnessing a democratization of evidence gathering, and the work of documentary photographers can influence many things. Next slide. However, they are still cautiously used in legal proceedings, and not every photo documented by human rights organizations or media professionals will be used. But I want to finish by the quote, by the quote of prosecutor from the War Department. Next slide. Which I think is inspirational for everyone who is involved in collecting photo evidences. Basically what he says, our activity, the activity of the War Department, is not only about informing someone of suspicion. It's about not losing knowledge of what is happening to us, of what the Russians are doing on our land. That is, finding and punishing the guilty is only one direction. It's equally important to preserve knowledge, find the truth, and probably so that our generation definitely doesn't forget, and those who will come after us also don't forget this. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Max. I will check with the organizers. Do we have time for one question? One question. If there is a question from the audience, I will give this right to one of you. No question.
No problem. I can ask, can the International Criminal Court pick up the images by itself and attach it to the document?
I think what would they do? They would contact Ukrainian legal professionals on the ground and will request them to corroborate on some specific case, because they needed to get verified first.
Thank you. Maybe then I will ask one last question to both Max from this historical retrospective on how photography was used in Nuremberg process, and Hanna, to you from this current on-the-ground perspective, because we were talking about the red lines in the photography from the media perspective, from the photography perspective. You touched a little bit on what are the requirements for the photography in like legal procedures, but if you could just with a couple of sentences share your perspective on are there any red lines in terms of ethical code that there might be for the image, taking into account that maybe not all of the images used in the court and procedures, legal procedures might be public. What are the differences here in regards to use of photography in art galleries or in journalism? If you have your thoughts, please share. Max, do you want to say a couple of words?
Obviously, there are very deep and important ethical considerations around spectatorship. I remember being surprised knowing, I didn't see it with my own eyes, but knowing about the exhibition by the UN of Cesar's pictures that came out of Syria, and the UN building in New York. Many dead, brutalized Syrian bodies were shown there. I don't think the same would have happened with American bodies, and so I think that kind of care is essential. Of course, I do believe in the necessity of looking at the atrocious image, but that should be done very carefully in a legal context that doesn't always need to become public in relation to people who have not survived the brutalities of which we speak.
Thank you. No?
I'm afraid I cannot go beyond some legal requirements, because when it comes to existing institutions, I think, like as I mentioned, with the case about European Court of the Human Rights, they're pretty loyal in terms of what can be and cannot be considered as a proof, and probably like general ethical standards are applied, like respect to victim, respect to dignity, no harm done by using this image, etc. When it comes to the International Criminal Court, they have a very specific set of rules, but also we expect, hopefully, creation of the separate tribunal for Russian war crimes, and probably they will come up with some other perspective and broaden this, what can be used and what cannot be used as an evidence. I don't know, like, I'm speculating here, sorry.
Thank you. I think we'll finish with this idea and thought for the future. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Anna. Thank you all for being so included. I saw your faces being very much involved in what our two speakers were sharing. I'm happy to give the mic to Max for the next panel. Thank you.